as we continued to the east into Sudan, we were told that it was the most dangerous road in Africa for vehicles. Very deep sand. The Nubian sands are very deep and very dry. And out of El Fasher, we lost one axle, and then we continued on, replaced it, and then you're on.
Yeah, so one of the things they had told us as we were heading east on this road that had all this sand on it, basically you're driving on the sand, it said to be very careful when you shift. So you can put your clutch in and shift and get it out fairly quickly, because if you don't, and then delay it a little too long and then let your clutch out, what happens is the sand grabs the tire at the slower speed, and you let the clutch out, and the motor then tries to turn the axle, but the sand around the wheels doesn't let it turn, and it will snap an axle. So we were forewarned about all this. Well, as we were driving, we're all taking turns driving and so forth. Well, this one day I was driving, and others were kind of resting or sleeping or whatever, so I was kind of cruising along by myself. And I felt I needed to downshift a little bit, that the sand was getting big, so I pushed the clutch in, changed the gear, and let it up, and apparently I let it up too slowly, because as soon as I let the clutch up, bing, and we had snapped an axle. So here we are, a four-wheel drive vehicle, just snapped, I think it was our front axle, is that right or rear? I forget.
Right rear.
Right rear, okay. Snapped an axle in the middle of the desert. What do we do now? Not even near any town. So we went into problem-solving mode, and I was the one, again, expediter finally came into play here another time, big time. And I had a little bit of Arabic that I'd learned from, because we lived in an Arabic-speaking part of Iran. I said, well, let me hitchhike a ride with some of the trucks that were going along that same route, because that was the main east-west route between Sudan and Chad here. And see if I, at the next town up here, see if there should be a Land Rover dealer, because that's what everybody's driving, and see if I can't get an axle there. And the rest of them would stay with the vehicle. So we waited a while, and finally a lorry came along, headed east, so I flagged him down and asked if I could get a ride to the next town. One of the things we were mildly concerned about is this was the Ramadan, the Islamic holiday when people were fasting, and sometimes because of that, a little edgy, and whether there'd be any problems on that. So I said, well, we'll just have to deal with it. So anyway, I told them what the situation was, and I wanted to hitchhike into the next town to see if I could find an axle. And so they said, sure. So I hopped in the back of the truck, and we rode off to the next town. And we got there, and trotting around and so forth. Well, I looked around town, and I could not find any Land Rover dealer at all. There just wasn't one there. So I had to, well, I guess that means I'm going to have to hitchhike to the next town down, so this is going to be longer. Well, I told the people what I thought I'd do is go to this first town, get an axle, and come back, so I'll probably be maybe 2 days max. But now I realized I was going to be probably 3 or 4. So first thing I had to do was find some other truck that was headed back west where they were. And I finally found one and said, hey, there's some folks out here. We broke an axle, and I'm in here looking for a replacement. But there's some folks with a Land Rover station wagon back there, 3 of them. If you could, when you go back that way, if you see that, stop and just tell them, I couldn't find an axle here. I'm going to have to go to the next town, and I'll be a little longer, just so they wouldn't be worrying about me. And again, like with all this courtesy and generosity stuff, they should, sure, no problem. And I found out later they got the message. But so then I had to find another truck going on east. But one of the things I discovered was happening while I was in town waiting for another truck there, all these Muslims celebrating Ramadan who could not eat from sunup to sundown and were obviously very hungry, came noon, they were offering me food. I said, but this is Ramadan. I said, well, yeah, but that's for us, not you. You can go ahead and eat. And so it was no problem for them, for me to eat during their religious holidays, even though it might be a little edgy from just being hungry. So again, another evidence of the things that Jeff has mentioned so often here. So anyway, I caught a truck eventually to the next town, and then it was kind of interesting because they did have a Land Rover dealer. So I went into the dealer, and I found it, went into the dealer. And I said, hey, we had broke one of our axles back down the road here. I wanted to see if I could find a replacement. Do you have any? He said, well, Land Rover? I said, yeah. He said, long wheelbase or short wheelbase? I said, long wheelbase. He said, front axle or rear axle? I said, rear. Right side or left side? I said, right side. to that specification. He went over it, and there was a whole pile of axles. There were that many axles were getting broken. So he had axles, piles of axles for every possible combination you get to. I really wanted to buy 2 axles in case we broke another one down the road, but I didn't have enough money, so I bought one and going to keep our fingers crossed. So I got it, got a ride with the truck going back to where the encampment was, and I got back, and everything went well from then. And Willard again was able to had enough mechanical knowledge to know how to replace an axle in the middle of the desert, which none of the rest of us had any clue about how to do that. So another success story at dealing with a problem, but there's another story to this story about what happened to the 3 of them while they were waiting for me for this 3 or 4 day trip I had. And I'll let Jeff.
Yeah, well, we were waiting for Dee. We were in this very small village.
Not in it, but near it even. You were just out on the road.
Yeah.
There's a village over at the side here a little way.
And the village was maybe 24 people, something like that, very small. And we were on the road, and it was so interesting. Every truck that went by would stop, and it would give us something. And so we ended up with chickens and tamarind juice and 2 tractors brandy and all this stuff. And it was really quite remarkable. Again,
now you know why they sent me on the trip, and they didn't get
exactly. That's why we broke the axle. And but it was interesting. The head person in this little village was a fellow by the name of Subil, and Subil was very dignified and always in a white robe and a white shish, the head thing, and he would make arrangements for Virginia, to go and meet with the women and so on. And what was interesting to me was it was years later that I found that Subil was the most powerful politician in Kordofan, this huge part of Sudan, and he was a part of the military council. And I had no idea who this guy was. It was quite remarkable. Anyway, we, thanks to Dee, had an axle replacement and went on. One of the problems was the very, very dry, deep sand, and it was for lorries. The trucks could go through this. Land Rover would be high-centered. And so we're sort of going in and out along the road, but through the bush until arriving at Khartoum and Omdurman. Mm-hmm. We continued into Sudan after having replaced the axle and so on, and got to El Fasher, and basically were able to relax a bit and found some really fascinating people. One was a young geographer who was trying to explain how differently geographers in Sudan saw the world. And he said there are these old lands and there are new lands, and the new lands are the occupied North America, Anglo-America, and so on. And it was just fascinating, and it's something that I wish, as a professor of geography, that could have explained more in greater detail. But it was interesting, met really interesting, largely educators in that. And then again, tried to leave the country and go south to our objective, Kenya, Tanzania, and so on. And it was very difficult to do. Tried to come into Ethiopia. There was tension involved and an unwillingness to give a visa. Tried to go south through Juba, and they said that area is closed because it's a training area for Congolese rebels, and there was just no way of getting out of the country, and so our plans
going south anyway. Yeah.
Going south.
Yeah.
And so we had to sort of revise our itinerary, and
because this was the whole original purpose and still the central objective of this whole trip was to get to the game preserves of East Africa, and basically once we got here and couldn't go south in Sudan and couldn't go east to Ethiopia, that meant there was no other way. We could fly in, we could boat in, but we could not drive from either Chad or Sudan down to East Africa. So we were having to give up a major reason for this whole trip, and just said we're going to have to go north and turn east and go into other parts of Asia. But when we had gone to the Ethiopian embassy to try to get permission to go into there and then south from there, they had said, well, we'd love to give you a visa and all, but the problem is the bridge between Sudan and Ethiopia that you have to cross to get over there, it's out. You just physically can't get across that river there right now. So love to, but I'm sorry, we can't. So yeah, tried, no, there's just no way to get you over there. So we were very discouraged. So we retreated and went to a bar to have a beer and kind of drown in our sorrows, if you will. And so we were sitting there moaning and groaning, and there was another Westerner sitting at a table somewhere nearby, and he was watching all of this. And finally he came over and struck up a conversation with us. It sounded like you guys are having a bad time about something or other. And so what's the problem? I said, well, we told him about going to the Ethiopian embassy, and they're telling us the bridge was out. And he started laughing. And we said, well, what are you laughing about? He said, well, I've been over that road. There is no bridge. We said, what do you mean there's no bridge? Why'd they tell us the bridge was out? Which says, well, the real reason they won't let you in, according to him anyway, was that we'd be going through a mountainous area, and there are rebels in the mountains that they can't control, and it is dangerous to drive through that area, and they're embarrassed to say, we can't control our own territory, it's too dangerous for you to drive there. So instead of saying that, they say, the bridge is out. So it made us feel a little bit better, but we still couldn't get the Ethiopia and get south, so we still had that problem. So basically, then what we did was we still had, many of us had told our friends in the States to send mail down to, where was it, Nairobi or someplace?
Uganda.
Uganda. And so we worried there might be mail down there, so we sent Virginia on a plane down to Uganda to pick up our mail and bring it back. We waited till she got back, and then we basically turned north and headed up through northern Sudan and Egypt. But I think maybe there was some more you wanted to say about all these relationships between Sudan and Ethiopia and maybe countries in that area.
Not necessarily. I mean, the whole area was so politically complex. The Congo at the time was engaged in a major revolution, and so this whole area and the stories that we heard of people selling human parts in markets and things of this nature, it was really fairly vivid. We headed north, and we were overlooking the Nile, and an elderly gentleman came up and inquired about our travels, and he was just this fascinating individual. He had, as we learned more and more about him, it turned out that he had been the first president of the Sudan, and he was the cultural attaché. He's an historian, F. Maghrebi, an historian who was serving as the cultural attaché in London, and then came back to be sort of a figurehead president in a way. And so he hosted us. And what was remarkable to me in part, it's a little bit like the sort of the bush telegraph or something in Chad with regard to wildlife. He knew where everything was happening in Khartoum and Omdurman and so on, where we could go, where we shouldn't go, and so on. And I was just so struck by sort of the depth and detail of the information. But he had this wonderful personal story of being descended from Libyan camel drivers. And he, again, was a professor of history at the University of Khartoum, and so that
And taught classes back in England, as I recall, right?
Yeah.
Was that right? Yeah.
his wife was a British nurse, and then we continued northward into what was the old Nubian civilization, Shindi, and so on. And there, our principal contact was Fritz Henze, who was an archaeologist from Humboldt University in East Germany. And just, I was involved in archaeology as well. His work was the most detailed, the most sophisticated I'd ever seen in my life. And he was so happy to be able to sort of show us around Musafrat and Sufr, and so on, and again, sort of entertain us and so on. But that area it had small pyramids, and in most cases they'd had the top blown off because people felt that there was wealth secured in the pyramids. And the whole area was just so fascinating, and the shards on the ground were, a lot of them were Chinese ceramics, and highly decorated, and this was the area from which the Chinese sort of captured giraffes and took them back to China, and all. It's a completely different story, but very interesting. And so we had a sort of an historical introduction to the area through Ev Maghrabi, an archaeological introduction to the area through Fritz Henze, and then traveled north and into Egypt. And it was a holiday. We couldn't travel legally, so we ran the border and tried to find someone to arrest us so we could
check in.
So we entered Egypt somewhat illegally, but the Egyptians were very generous. We had driven down the eastern desert and then turned in toward Aswan Dam. The dam was interesting because it had been constructed initially by Morrison Knudsen Corporation, Boise, Idaho, and they're finding it's a concave dam, and the western buttress of it was leaking, and so the Americans were concerned that they were going to be stuck with this collapsing dam. And so they turned it over, because the government kept shifting its alliances, turned it over to the Russians. And of course, this was during the Soviet period. And the Soviets somehow solved the problem by injecting colloidal material, cement, or reconstructing that area. And so it's seen as a sort of a Russian triumph, and one of the reasons why the Egyptians felt so warmly toward the Soviets. We then went to stepped back into antiquity, into the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens, and again, these are just they're really quite remarkable, and sufficiently well known that we don't need to go into much detail, but. The tombs and the artistic representation of sacred animals, objects, symbols, and so on were really fascinating. And we traveled from there northward toward Cairo. And do you want to mention the?
Yeah. When we got to Cairo, we were driving around the city a bit, and it was the only time in our whole trip, before or after, we never had something like this occur, but it was the only time when we had overt hostility expressed to us. What happened was, we found when we were driving down through some of the crowded streets in Cairo, kids started throwing sticks and rocks at us. And it didn't do any serious damage, but it was clear they did not see us as somebody they had a welcoming feeling about. And after that happened, of course we were stunned by it because it hadn't happened in all of our trip thus far. And we weren't sure, we tried to think about why would that be going on. And we sort of attributed it to two things. One was the sort of the colonialism of the West, things taken over there and left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. But we thought maybe the other factor was the fact that Egypt is probably the focus of more tourist travel at that time in the mid-60s, especially of people from Europe. That's just a hop, skip, and a jump across the Mediterranean for them. It's an easy thing to visit a very different kind of country, and with things like the Valley of the King and Queens that go back to 2000 BC or whatever. And so there was a lot of tourists. Well, you get a very crowded place with lots of tourists, with people coming in with money, and you don't have money. It'd be easy to foment feelings of resentment. And our conclusion was that's what we were experiencing, even though we weren't part of that. When they saw Western area, they saw a group of people that they had not pleasant feelings about. But after we finished going around Cairo and out to the Sphinx and visiting there, and then we finished that and turned north and went from Cairo up to the coast to the town of Alexandria, which is where we were going to catch a ferry over to eventually to Beirut. But while we were in Alexandria, we had a chance to see some other things that Jeff can share about.
Yeah, just a further comment on the Aswan Dam. It was irrelevant. There already were barrages in the Nile that could take care of the issues of the flood, the period of the flood, which is so important.
When you say irrelevant, you don't mean politically, you mean as an economic development mechanism?
Yes, yeah. That the river was already controlled. And what was interesting to me was the Lake Nasser destroyed Wadi Halfa, an upstream community. It just engulfed it. It engulfed much of the archaeological works along the river. It increased because of perennial irrigation. It increased disease, schistosomiasis, guinea worm, and so on, because of the irrigation, expansion of irrigation. And it was interesting, and a little bit along the themes of what Dee had mentioned, this idea that these improvements, weren't really carefully thought through. The consequences of them, the social impacts, the environmental impacts, and so on. We got up to Alexandria as on the coast, the Mediterranean coast, and there were a number of things. One is, in terms of antiquities, it's an interesting area because the Greek statuary in Alexandria is just remarkable. And the Greeks say that it's better than anything in Greece. But we found the area to be interesting. The pyramids, of course, were very much of interest. And we went from Alexandria, and I might mention that the dam also is a sediment trap. And so the annual enrichment of the agricultural land was broken because of the dam. And the delta is systematically eroding. And so it's affected the fisheries and the kinds of things that I do with regard to environmentalism. We went then from Alexandria, we went to Limassol in Cyprus, and were able to see a bit of the city. We were there for 7 hours, and then went on to Beirut,